August 6, 1945, Hiroshima woke peacefully. The sky was clear and blue. 14-year-old Kenji Sato adjusted his school uniform. Cicadas buzzed loudly in the heat. Breakfast rice steamed on the table. His mother smiled faintly. War had already taken much, but this morning felt ordinary. Air raid sirens had been quiet. Too quiet. American B-29 bombers flew high above. Too high to hear clearly. One plane carried something new, something never used before. 8:15 a.m. Kenji stepped outside. Sunlight warmed his face. He looked up. A silver dot in the sky. He squinted. Then a flash. Brighter than the sun. White swallowed everything. Heat slammed into him, like a furnace exploding. Windows shattered instantly. Walls collapsed. The world turned fire. Kenji was thrown across the street. His ears rang violently. Silence, then roaring wind. A shockwave tore through the city. Buildings folded like paper. Roofs flew into the sky. People vanished in light. Shadows burned into stone. Kenji struggled to breathe. Dust filled his mouth. Smoke darkened the sky. The city was gone. Just moments ago. Now ruins. Fires spread everywhere. Cries echoed through rubble. Help me, mother. Water. Kenji forced himself up. His arms were burned. Skin hung loose. He didn't understand yet. The bomb exploded 600 meters above. It was called Little Boy, dropped by the Enola Gay. Nearly 70,000 died instantly. More would die later. Kenji searched for his home. Nothing remained. Only flames. He called for his mother. No answer. Black rain began falling. Thick, oily drops. It tasted bitter. No one knew it was radioactive. Survivors wandered silently. Clothes burned away faces unrecognizable. Some walked without skin. Arms stretched forward, like ghosts. The river filled with bodies. People jumped in to escape fire. Many never came out. The sky turned dark. Noon looked like night. Kenji kept walking. Each step hurt. He saw a school friend, barely alive. They stared at each other. No words came. Only shock. Only disbelief. The sun had fallen from the sky, and nothing would ever be the same. Hiroshima was no longer a city. The blast was over, but the terror was just beginning. From the heart of Hiroshima, smoke rose in dark pillars, casting long, mournful shadows over a city reduced to ruins. As far as the eye could see, there was only devastation. Amidst the chaos, a young man named Kenji Sato staggered to his feet. A wave of pain washed over him, a symphony of agony from every part of his body. Dust, thick and gritty, coated his eyes and filled his lungs, making each breath a struggle. Nothing felt normal. The very ground beneath him was cracked and shattered, like a pane of broken glass. A profound, unnatural silence had fallen over parts of the city, a quiet so deep it was deafening. But soon, that silence was broken by the cries of the living. The heartbreaking calls of women searching for lost husbands, the desperate pleas of children for their mothers. The sights were unimaginable. Bodies lay strewn across the landscape, their forms barely distinguishable from the ash and rubble. In the distance, the skeletal remains of a wall smoldered, the air still thick with a searing heat. Kenji looked down at his own arms. They felt numb, disconnected. His clothes were in tatters, partially burned away. A shiver ran through him, a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. He had to move. He had to go forward. Flames licked at splintered wood beams, and the skeleton of a collapsed building seemed to moan as the wind passed through it. Then a whisper cut through the noise. His name? He turned, and his heart sank. It was a classmate, but her face was a mask of horror, her skin blistered and raw. Her eyes, wide with shock, conveyed a terror beyond words. Without speaking, they clasped hands, a silent acknowledgement of their shared nightmare. Together, they began to walk through the endless rubble. They passed eerie, dark shadows burned onto concrete walls and steps, the final, silent imprints of people who had been vaporized in an instant. These were the nuclear shadows, permanent, silent remnants of vanished lives. The intense heat of the blast had etched their shapes into the city forever. No one spoke. Thinking was a luxury they couldn't afford. The smoke on the horizon was a choking, impenetrable wall. A low, distant groan echoed through the ruins. Another building giving way. Survivors pressed forward, a procession of the wounded. Some limped, others crawled on hands and knees. Many couldn't walk at all. People clutched at burned limbs, their faces contorted in pain. Others lay unmoving, their journey over. The desperate pleas for water went largely unanswered. Few had anything to give. Kenji eventually found his way to a riverbank. The water glistened faintly under the smoky sky. He dipped his trembling hands into the cool current, but it offered no real relief. Radiation sickness was a silent, invisible poison, and its devastating effects were only just beginning to unfold. By that night, the sickness began to claim more victims. Hair fell out in clumps. Gums started to bleed. A burning fever flushed the cheeks of the afflicted. The weeks that followed were a blur of pain. Days melted into a continuous state of agony. Aid was slow to arrive. The few doctors who survived worked without rest, but the hospitals had been destroyed. Open fields were transformed into makeshift wards, filled with the moans of the dying. Kenji did what he could to help the injured. He held the hands of those in their final moments. The weeks that followed were a blur of pain. Days melted into a continuous state of agony. Aid was slow to arrive. The few doctors who survived worked without rest, but the hospitals had been destroyed. Open fields were transformed into makeshift wards. He held the hands of those in their final moments. Their soft moans, a sound that would stay with him for the rest of his life. A deep, gnawing guilt began to take root in his soul, the guilt of being a survivor. In nearby towns, a new kind of fear began to spread. Civilians were warned to stay away from Hiroshima. Rumors about the mysterious sickness created widespread panic. Some believed the illness was contagious, and the survivors, the hibakusha, began to face a cruel stigma. People refused them food and shelter, shunning them as if they were carriers of a plague. Kenji learned this new word, hibakusha, explosion-affected person. It was a label that would follow him and the other survivors for the rest of their lives. Even decades later, the suffering continued. Friends he had known, fellow survivors, disappeared one by one, succumbing to long-term illnesses. The burn scars they carried were not just on their skin, but etched deep into their memories. Yet, even in the darkest of times, there were moments of peace, glimmers of hope. A profound sense of grief bonded the broken community together. Shattered families rose from the ashes to rebuild their homes. Slowly, painstakingly, the ruined streets began to take shape once more. Eventually, a memorial park would stand where the heart of the destruction had been. One spring day, many years later, Kenji planted a tree there. His hands still shook with the memory of that day, but as he patted the soil around the young sapling, he felt a sense of purpose. If this story touched you, please consider sharing it so that we never forget. 3 days after Hiroshima burned, another bomb fell. Nagasaki. August 9th, 1945. The world did not yet understand the full scope of what had happened, but it felt the shockwaves ripple across the globe. In Hiroshima, beneath a piece of torn, dusty cloth, a young man named Kenji lay weak. A fever gripped his body, relentless and consuming. His hair began falling out in clumps, collecting on the makeshift pillow beneath his head. Strange, purple bruises started to appear on his skin, like dark blossoms blooming on a dying plant. Doctors, their faces etched with exhaustion and confusion, whispered new, terrifying words. Radiation sickness? There was no known cure, only hope, as fragile as a cherry blossom in a storm. Entire families seemed to disappear overnight. Some were vaporized in the initial blast, while others succumbed to their injuries in the hours and days that followed. A constant plume of smoke still rose from the ruins, a gray monument to the city that was. The air was thick with the smell of ash, iron, and something else. Something indescribable and final. Relief workers began to arrive, but slowly, cautiously. Supplies were dangerously low. Food was scarce, and medicine was even scarcer. Survivors, their faces blank with shock, lined up silently, day after day. They were waiting for help. They were waiting for answers. But none came. The world they knew had ended, and no one could tell them why. Then, on August 15th, 1945, a sound crackled to life from radios across Japan. It was the voice of Emperor Hirohito. Trembling, but resolute, he announced the unthinkable. Japan would surrender. The war was over. For some, the news brought tears of relief, the end of a long, brutal conflict. But for others, there was only a profound emptiness. What did victory or defeat mean in a city that was no longer there? In Hiroshima, the end of the war felt like a whisper in a hurricane. Weeks passed. Kenji, gaunt but alive, finally stepped outside. The sky above was a brilliant, cloudless blue. It looked innocent, peaceful. But Kenji knew better. He no longer trusted blue skies. Before him, rubble stretched to the horizon, an endless sea of destruction. Twisted steel girders reached up like skeletal hands. Burned-out trees stood as black silhouettes against the sky. But in the distance, one structure remained. Its dome was shattered, its walls scarred, but it was still standing, a silent, defiant witness to the apocalypse. Kenji stared at it for a long, long time. In that moment, the memories flooded back. The blinding flash of light, more brilliant than 1,000 suns. The wave of intense, searing heat that followed. The screams that were swallowed by the roar of the explosion. And then, the black rain, sticky and radioactive, that fell from the sky. By the end of that year, nearly 140,000 people in Hiroshima were gone. Some died instantly, their shadows burned into the pavement. Others died slowly, painfully, from the invisible poison that coursed through their veins. The bomb didn't just kill, it tormented. In the years that followed, a strange, resilient life began to return to Hiroshima. The city started to rebuild itself, piece by painstaking piece. Streets were cleared of debris. New homes rose from the ashes of the old. Schools reopened their doors, and the sound of children's laughter, once silenced, began to fill the air again. But the scars remained. They were etched onto the skin of the survivors, in the tissue of their lungs, and deep within their memories. Kenji carried the physical burn marks on his arms for the rest of his life. But he also carried a silent weight in his heart. The survivors, known as hibakusha, faced a second ordeal. Many employers feared their sickness, real or imagined. Neighbors whispered rumors, born of fear and ignorance. The hibakusha learned to endure twice. First, they survived the bomb. Then, they had to survive the stigma that followed. Decades later, Kenji, now an old man, stood in a peaceful, green park. It was built on the very ground where fire and chaos once ruled. He watched as families gathered by the river, releasing paper lanterns that floated gently on the current. Each lantern held a name. Each tiny flame was a prayer, a memory, honoring a life that was lost. He closed his eyes. He could hear the cicadas singing in the late summer air. It was the same sound he'd heard on that morning, just moments before the world changed forever. And in that quiet moment of reflection, he finally understood something profound. The bomb had ended a war, yes, but it had also begun a warning to all of humanity. We now held the power of the sun in our hands. A terrifying power never meant to be unleashed upon our cities, upon ourselves. Hiroshima was no longer just a place of tragedy. It had become a message, a universal plea for peace. Kenji whispered softly to himself, the words carried away on the evening breeze, never again. And in the quiet halls of power, in the hearts of ordinary people across the world, his message was heard. The world listened. One flash changed the course of history. One city carried the memory, and one survivor carried the truth that the greatest power humanity holds is not destruction. It is choosing peace. Thank you for watching.